We spoke about debt by nation, and today we take a quick view of U.S. consumer debt and at G7 disposable income before talking about income inequality, highlighted by those yellow vest protesters in France. To do so, we are pleased and honored to once again be joined by Professor Emeritus at the University of Massachusetts, Amherst, Professor Richard Wolff. Professor, great to see you again.
Thank you, Bart. Glad to be here.
So Americans now owe more than ever. They owe more than ever. Consumer debt, which takes in credit cards and personal and student loans, is over $4 trillion this year. At the same time, mortgage levels are nearly as high as they were before the housing crisis. We're just talking about the Great Recession, with homeowners owing $10.3 trillion in the most recent data. That's up by 2.8% year over year. These seem like pretty horrific numbers to me, but you're the economist, Professor. What do they mean to you?
Well, they're pretty scary, and I think you don't need to be an economist to know that if you have not learned the lesson of the last credit collapse, the subprime mortgage collapse, we used to call it back in 2008 and 9, you should, because these numbers indicate that even if people learned the lesson, the fact is that the incomes of most Americans, and this is true in other countries too, simply did not go up over the last decade, while the cost of leading a decent life, getting your kids a college education if possible, having a vacation once in a while, cost more. Your income didn't go up, and your solution, even if you were worried, was to borrow more money. And again, the basic law of economics, if your underlying income is not going up, but your debt levels are, it's only a matter of when, not whether, that you're going to hit crunch time and the economy is going to crack because people can't keep going. They can't even service the debt they have, and so they can't buy goods and services, and then we have the crash. It's a horrific feeling for some of us. It's like being on a train rushing towards a stone wall. Everybody sees it, but seems unable to take the steps to prevent the disaster.
It's almost like a death spiral, and it reminds me, it's been a long time since you or I probably watched Sesame Street, but you have all these things that look the same: increasing housing, increasing transportation, increased health care, but income's not increasing. Which thing does not look like the other? And it's income, as you say. But I want to take a look at the wider world, at least at the G7 countries, Professor, in terms of disposable income. If it were like the old school G8, which included Russia would actually be at lowest in terms of disposable income. But of the current G7 members, when we look at this chart, actually Canada and the UK citizens have more disposable income, Italy the lowest, and in the middle of the pack, Germany, the US, and Japan, and France. I mean, what do you make of these numbers of household debt?
Again, I think they're frightening. I think what we're seeing is grudgingly, more and more people are loading up with one or another kind of debt. I think that behind many of the political events of our time is the anxiety of people who don't see rising incomes but do see rising debts, and that's a very depressing situation. I think it lies in part behind the anger of the British people to vote against staying in Europe, which isn't going to solve their problem. It's behind the anger of the American people voting for Trump, which isn't going to solve their problem. And in France, you see it with this yellow vest movement, because they've made it crystal clear that the combination of weak income, no future, and rising debts is what brings them into the street. I think you're seeing the building of a kind of pressure cooker in which debt is playing a very central role in galvanizing people's uneasiness about where their economies are taking them.
Well, let's move to that, because, because it's not just the U.S. I mean, we've got some specific problems we've spoken about in the U.S., but, income inequality is a problem the world over. And I just wonder if this circumstance with the yellow vest protesters in France is really a microcosm of a movement that might be beginning. It started with just a couple of issues. Now it really seems to have emerged, Professor, into more income inequality overall. And do you think as that those figures and the haves and the have-nots and the one thing doesn't seem like the other, as those continue to exacerbate, are we going to see more of this, do you think? More of these protests, more of these concerns by average folks who have just are sort of mad as hell and not going to take it anymore?
I'm convinced that you are already seeing it. There have been yellow vests in Belgium. There has been a sizable yellow vest movement in the Netherlands. It is already major news across Europe. But I don't think it's going to stop, not only because it's already some evidence of it. I think that there is a combination of building anger and rage from below and a level of being out of touch with it at the top that promises more trouble. Let me give you one illustration. This morning in France, Mr. Macron, the president, named a woman minister who would run the debate that he's called for over the issues raised by the Yellow Vest movement, mostly issues about the mass of the French people not having enough money to live a decent life. The newspapers in France this morning published the income that would be earned by the minister who would lead this discussion, a woman who, by the way, has already resigned. Her income was to be in the neighborhood of 200,000 US dollars, the equivalent. Okay, that is so crazy. That is so insulting to the mass of the French people that it will stimulate more yellow vests. It's so outrageous, it kind of boggles the mind. But it suggests the inability of those sitting at the top to even understand the most basic reality motivating those at the bottom, and that's a sign of a lot of trouble coming down the pike.
Professor, before we go, I want to ask you one other question, and I apologize, it sort of comes out of left field, and I know you're not a political analyst, but you're just as good as anybody else, if not better. So you think about, like, Catalonia, you think about Brexit, you think about Donald Trump in the U.S., and I wonder if these movements, political movements, if you will, where people have just said, we've had enough, are they, do you think, a reflection also of this inequality gap, or do you think there's something different?
No, I'm convinced it's the inequality gap. Look, here's the way I make sense of it. Dealing with the inequality gap puts you right up against the capitalist economic system that we live with. It is very scary, especially after half a century of Cold War, to think, let alone act, around the notion that the economic system you've accepted and lived with is what has to change, what maybe even has to go because of the inequality. So people look for something else that they can change in the hope, vain, I believe, but in the honest hope that maybe if we're British and we get out of Europe, or maybe if we're American and we don't let refugees and immigrants from Central America in, or if we're in Hungary and we don't let desperate people from Syria in, that change will deal with what's upsetting us. It won't. It'll take a few years before that's clear to people, but I think these are what we call displacements of an economic problem, inequality, our economic system, but there are still enough people scared of dealing with that issue that they look for something else they can change in the kind of almost mystical hope that getting out of Europe or blocking the border or something like that will get them back to some sort of economic equilibrium. It won't. We've been there, we've done that. It's too little and it's too late. You got to deal with the economic problem because in the end, that's the problem that we have to solve.
Well, we're going to continue to talk about it. We so much appreciate your assistance in that regard. Professor Richard Wolff, thank you, Professor. Appreciate it.
Thank you. I'm glad to do it.